At the dawn of the 20th century, the development of the Industrial Revolution within the United States was evolving at a rapid pace. And with it, a growing number of workers found themselves with workplace injuries that not only were costly in terms of health care, but also in terms of their long-term employability. Workers, labor rights activists, and legislators alike began to see the need for a workers' compensation system that would protect both the employer and the employee with less of a burden on the judicial system. In the early 1900s, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Montana each introduced workers' compensation statutes that were eventually struck down. After several failed attempts, New York State finally managed to pass the first compulsory Workers' Compensation Act in the nation on June 25, 1910. However, like the others before it, this act would not stand the test of time. On March 24, 1911, the New York Court of Appeals declared the state's compulsory workers' compensation law unconstitutional. The following day, in a cruel twist of fate, that decision would be put to the highest test of all. Saturday, March 25, 1911. Unseasonably warm weather has brought New York City to life as it wakes from its wintertime slumber in anticipation of spring. In Lower Manhattan, approximately 500 garment workers file into the top 3 floors of the 10-story Ash Building to begin their shift at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Near closing time, a fire ignites on the upper floors. Within 18 minutes, that tragic fire would take the lives of 146 Triangle Shirtwaist Company employees. This fire was among the most deadly and horrific workplace disasters in American history. Doomed by locked exits and a single rusty fire escape that eventually collapsed, many of the victims, mostly young immigrant women, were burned alive, asphyxiated by smoke, or lost their lives after desperately leaping 9 stories to the pavement below. Adding to their grief, the families of the victims received scant compensation and were left without any means of support by their employer. The public outcry in the aftermath of the fire and the circumstances surrounding it was unlike anything the country had ever witnessed. In May of that year, Wisconsin became the first state to pass a comprehensive workers' compensation law. As pressure mounted from activist groups who were looking for answers, New York's Governor Alden Dix took action in June 1911 and created the Factory Investigating Commission. One of that commission's lead investigators was a young social worker named Frances Perkins. An eyewitness to the fire, Ms. Perkins would devote the rest of her life to improving working conditions for all Americans. As attention to this issue grew, and with the labor movement now at full throttle, the victims of this fire continued to weigh heavily on the minds of voters as they went to the polls on November 4, 1913. As a direct result of the tragic fire, the New York State Legislature put forward a referendum amending the state constitution. This legislation was ultimately approved, allowing the passage of a compulsory New York State workers' compensation law, effective July 1, 1914, and with it, the creation of the New York State Insurance Fund. 199 Church Street in Lower Manhattan is considered a local fixture by those who live and work here. In the shadow of high-rise apartment buildings and the steel columns of One World Trade Center, its canopy, brick exterior, and mosaics stand out among contemporaries of the period. At the entrance, a bas-relief reads, "Dedicated to the service of the people of the state of New York," a most fitting inscription when considering the residents. This building is home to the New York State Insurance Fund, the largest state workers' compensation insurance fund in the country. With nearly 2,500 full-time employees and 12 business offices covering every region of the state, it's the 6th largest writer of workers' compensation insurance in the country. From its inception in 1914, the fund was charged with guaranteeing that workers' compensation insurance, now mandatory, was available at a fair price at all times to any business operating in New York State, regardless of the risks inherent to that business. The new law establishing this system took effect on July 1st of that year, and on that very same day, the State Insurance Fund wrote its very first workers' compensation insurance policy. That initial policy covered workers at the American Manufacturing Company of Brooklyn, a company that made rope used in the all-important shipping trade of the early 20th century. This newly created agency built its reputation by providing insurance to industries such as heavy manufacturing and other high-risk commercial enterprises that could be denied coverage by the private insurance carriers. Back in Albany, lawmakers realized that it was equally as important that a stable market for New York workers' compensation insurance remain intact. To accomplish this task, the fund was firmly established as a competitive insurance carrier. Because only by competing with private insurers to attract preferred business would the fund be able to serve businesses the private sector found less desirable. This business model most certainly paid off, because other than the initial startup expenses during its first 2 years of existence, the fund has operated entirely as a self-sustaining public agency at absolutely no cost to New York taxpayers ever since. Over the next 100 years, the fund would not only remain relevant, but would prove time and time again the historical significance of the workers' compensation law. Today, customers can obtain quotes through its website at NYSIF.com, where policyholders can file and track claims and report payroll online. But in those early years, things were altogether different. In 1914, the State Insurance Fund's first representatives stayed on the road for months at a time as they traveled from New York City to every corner of the state. From a shoe plant in the southern tier, to a cider mill in central New York, west to a wool factory outside of Buffalo, north to a creamery along the St. Lawrence Seaway, and south again to a brush company on Long Island. These early payroll auditors were quick to adapt and respond to changing circumstances, a characteristic that would become the hallmark for the entire organization during the decades to come. In the 1920s, under the leadership of a now seasoned Francis Perkins, the fund was at the forefront of creating safety groups, allowing it to insure entire industries who were left exposed by the private sector. A few years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would make Ms. Perkins the Secretary of Labor, the first female cabinet member in the nation's history. By the late 30s, the fund was insuring more than 44,000 employers, and the biggest projects of the day, including the Midtown Tunnel, the 6th Avenue Subway, and the 1939 World's Fair. The Second World War would test the fund with the rising frequency of industrial accidents caused by wartime emergency working conditions. The fund not only responded to this wartime crisis, but also aided the efforts of those who were serving their country in Europe, eventually receiving national attention for its deep commitment in supporting blood drives and the war bond purchase program. In 1950, the state's disability law took effect, requiring covered employers to provide employees with insurance for lost wages resulting from off-the-job injury or illness. The fund responded by writing approximately 13,000 policies in the law's first year alone. Then, now, and always is the trademark of the State Insurance Fund. But despite this distinction, and above all else, many simply refer to it as the insurer that cares. With the city and state in the throes of a financial crisis in the 1970s, it was the fund's $715 million investment in MAC bonds and other state obligations that helped turn near bankruptcy into an economic recovery. It cared enough to insure the contractors and subcontractors during the construction of the World Trade Center Twin Towers in 1967, and was there to assist the victims and families after the towers collapsed during the attack on 9/11. The fund's aggressive workers' comp anti-fraud campaign, which started in the mid-90s, has saved New York businesses more than $225 million to date. And its tireless work to ensure that uninterrupted services were delivered after Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, Superstorm Sandy, and 9/11 have not gone unnoticed. Through it all, the fund's most important resource has always been its employees. With the dedication, knowledge, and empathy required to deliver outstanding customer service, the fund remains a reliable and trusted source for continually making workers' compensation and disability benefits insurance available to any employer in New York State. It's one of the primary reasons why many of its earliest policyholders remain part of the insurance fund family today.
Our employees are what have allowed us to get to where we are, 140 years, and the State Insurance Fund looks out for our employees and makes sure that they're protected.
With something as important as an insurance carrier, for us, the stability of having a carrier that knows our business, knows our people, and will be there when we need them is absolutely paramount.
We know brushes. That's our forte, and that's what we know really well. And the State Insurance Fund knows safety and knows how to cover for that safety. And we look to partner with the State Insurance Fund to cover what they know best. And when the relationship works, there's no reason to change it.
It's important for us that when there is a claim, that it's addressed quickly and resolved quickly. It's important that when we call with questions that they get answered fast and accurately, and the State Insurance Fund has done both.
Congratulations and well done. Keep up the good work. I look forward to another 100 years.
Congratulations to the State Insurance Fund on its centennial. We're happy to be with you for the last century, and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery looks forward to the next century with the State Insurance Fund.
Perhaps Major Nicholas W. Muller summed it up best in the fund's 1939 annual report when he said, "There is an enduring spirit, born of an ideal, that vitalizes every successful organization. That spirit in the State Insurance Fund always has, is, and always will be the spirit of service." Today, that spirit resides at 199 Church Street, as well as the other regional offices that together celebrate the first 100 years of service to the people of New York State.